sunset. He knew what sunset was supposed to look like. He had seen thousands of them projected across the ceiling of the city. He knew the soft amber glow, the gradual fading of gold into violet, the way artificial evening moved over glass buildings and narrow streets until every district seemed to sigh and settle into night. But somewhere above him, beyond layers of water, pressure, darkness, and distance, the real sun was setting every day. And John had never seen it. Not once. For almost 70 years, his entire world had existed beneath a vast glass dome resting on the floor of the Indian Ocean. The city was called Kremenos. Its name came from an ancient word meaning hidden, and hidden was exactly what it was. From the surface, there was almost nothing to reveal its existence. No towers rose from the sea. No bridges reached toward the land. No lights shimmered above the waves at night. Ships crossing the region saw only open water stretching toward the horizon. But far below them, beneath the quiet weight of the sea, more than 30 million people lived beneath a transparent sky. They woke in apartments. They waited for buses. They hurried to offices. They bought coffee from small cafes tucked into narrow streets. Children carried school bags beneath imitation maple trees. Couples walked beside artificial rivers. Old men fed pigeons in public squares built to resemble places they had once known on the surface. And above all of them, instead of clouds, there were fish. Some mornings, silver schools drifted over the city in such numbers that they darkened the dome. At night, deep-sea creatures moved through the water like wandering constellations, their bodies glowing blue, green, and violet in the darkness. For those born in Kremenos, this was normal. The ocean was not something they visited. It was the sky. John lived on the 37th floor of a narrow apartment building in a district modeled after Chicago. The city planners had reproduced the broad streets, the dark brick buildings, the elevated tracks, and even the wind. Huge turbines hidden along the upper rim of the dome sent cool gusts between the buildings at carefully timed intervals. The people called it the Wind District. Visitors often stood at street corners, laughing as their coats fluttered around them, delighted by the strange sensation. John had grown so accustomed to it that he barely noticed. He noticed other things instead. The faint vibration of the dome before the morning lights came on, the soft hum of pumps moving water through the city's systems, the gradual awakening of traffic, the quiet click of street lamps turning off one by one as the artificial dawn spread overhead. His alarm rang every morning at 5. It had rung at 5 for more years than he cared to count. On the morning this story begins, the alarm sounded in the darkness, sharp and insistent. John opened one eye. The room around him remained dim. Beyond the curtains, the nightlife of the Wind District was only beginning to fade. Neon signs from bars and late-night restaurants painted shifting bands of pink and blue across the wall. He reached out and silenced the alarm. Then he closed his eye again. 5 minutes later, it rang a second time. He sighed, turned onto his back, and listened to the joints in his shoulders complain. The third alarm finally pulled him from bed. He sat for a moment with his feet resting on the cold floor. His knees ached, his hands felt stiff. There had been a time when he could climb service ladders for hours without stopping. There had been a time when he carried tanks, ropes, buckets, and cleaning equipment as though they weighed nothing. That time had quietly gone. sunlight had reached the surface. Filtered through hundreds of meters of water, it arrived as a faint greenish glow. For a few minutes each morning, before the city's own lights became brighter, the ocean revealed itself in shades of blue and shadow. John pressed one hand against the window. A large ray drifted overhead. Its wide fins moved slowly, almost lazily, as though it were flying through the darkness. Behind it came a scattering of tiny fish, each one flashing silver as it turned. John watched until they disappeared between the outlines of two towers. Then he went to the kitchen. Breakfast was the same as always. Oats imported from Canada. Milk from one of the agricultural sectors near the Cairo district. Dried seaweed harvested outside the western wall. He ate, standing beside the counter, listening to the low voice of the morning news coming from a small speaker. The report mentioned construction in the western expansion. No one yet knew which city would be added. Some believed it would be Buenos Aires. Others insisted that the planners had chosen Mexico City. A presenter claimed to have seen architectural plans resembling Sao Paulo, though no one knew whether the documents were genuine. John smiled. For months, the mystery had become a kind of citywide game. Every cafe had a theory. Every newspaper printed a new rumor. Every taxi driver knew someone who knew someone working on the project. John hoped for Buenos Aires. He had once seen a photograph of its broad avenues and pale stone buildings in an old magazine. Something about the image had stayed with him. After breakfast, he took a cold shower, dressed in worn denim overalls, and buttoned a faded work shirt underneath. His name was stitched over the left pocket. The thread had once been white. Now it was grey. He looked at himself in the mirror. A thin face, short silver hair, dark skin lined by years, eyes that still seemed alert even when the rest of him felt tired. Less than 6 months remained before retirement. For nearly 50 years, John had worked as a dome cleaner. Most people assumed his job was simple. They imagined buckets, soap, rubber blades, and long afternoons wiping dust from glass. But the glass surrounding Kremenos was not ordinary glass. It was the wall between the city and the ocean. More than 3 feet thick in most places, reinforced with transparent composite layers, it held back millions of tons of water. John's responsibility was not merely to clean it. He inspected it. He searched for stress marks, surface fractures, pressure distortions, faulty seals, mineral buildup, and anything else that might threaten the city. In half a century, he had discovered only one genuine crack. It had been shorter than his smallest finger and had not penetrated the inner layers. Still, the entire section had been replaced. That single crack had taught him something he had never forgotten. Safety often depended upon noticing what everyone else overlooked. He left his apartment and rode the elevator down. At street level, the artificial morning had begun. The lights embedded in the upper structure of the dome brightened gradually, never switching on all at once. A pale glow touched the rooftops, then the windows, then the streets. The city seemed to emerge from darkness, piece by piece. John walked toward the parking structure. A cleaning truck waited for him on the 3rd level, filled with hoses, brushes, inspection lamps, sealant, climbing equipment, and several long-handled squeegees. He started the engine. The dashboard flickered to life. Today's route appeared on the display. Little Lisbon, New York, Second Seoul, a section near the central ring, and one unusual note at the bottom. Meet trainee at 9 o'clock. John stared at the message for a moment. So this was the day. The city had been discussing his replacement for weeks, but until now the idea had not felt real. A replacement meant retirement was no longer an abstract promise. It meant someone else would learn the roads he knew. Someone else would hold the inspection light against the dome. Someone else would drive through the sleeping city before dawn. Someone else would inherit the work that had shaped almost every year of his adult life. John turned on the radio and pulled into the morning traffic. Kremenos had been built as a collection of the world. 30 nations had contributed engineers, architects, laborers, scientists, artists, and planners. Rather than imitate a single city, they had chosen 32. Each district reproduced the architecture, streets, public spaces, and atmosphere of a famous place on the surface. John drove from Chicago into a narrow stretch modeled after Cape Town. The road widened. Low, pale buildings appeared on either side. Artificial mountain silhouettes rose beyond them, shaped into the city's internal structure. A few minutes later, the architecture changed again. Curved facades, brightly painted walls, old European rooftops, Prague. Then came the highway toward Paris. Language changed with each district. Radio advertisements shifted from English to Afrikaans, then Czech, then French. Shop signs changed. Street food changed. Even the design of benches and traffic signals changed. John had never left Kremenos, yet he had spent a lifetime moving through copies of the world. He knew where to find the richest coffee. He knew which neighborhood sold the softest bread. He knew where the night market stayed open until dawn. He knew which rooftops offered the clearest view of migrating whales. He knew which streets became crowded after football matches, and which gardens remained quiet even on holidays. But there was one thing he did not know: whether the copies felt anything like the originals. That question had begun to trouble him more as retirement approached, perhaps because he finally had time to think about it, perhaps because soon he would no longer have work to distract him, perhaps because the real world above the water had always seemed safely distant, and now it was beginning to call him. He had purchased a ticket for a submarine journey to London. The booking was for 2 weeks after his final day. His friends had laughed when he told them. Why spend so much money traveling to London, they asked, when the London district stood less than 20 minutes from his apartment. Kremenos had its own Thames, its own red buses, its own stone bridges, its own narrow streets. It even had its own London Eye. But John did not want to see a careful recreation. He wanted to stand beneath an open sky. He wanted to feel wind that had not come from a machine. He wanted to see clouds moving without a schedule. And more than anything else, he wanted to watch the real sun disappear. He drove into Little Lisbon shortly after 7. The district always seemed calmer than the others. White buildings lined the streets. Their tiled roofs glowed orange beneath the artificial morning. The roads were narrow and uneven, paved with pale stone that reflected the light. At the far edge of the district, the streets opened toward a wide artificial beach. There was no water inside the dome. Instead, clean sand extended toward the glass wall. Beyond it, the real ocean began. From a distance, the boundary was almost invisible. The beach seemed to continue into the sea. John lowered his window. The air smelled faintly of salt. Small scent nozzles hidden beneath the sand released bursts of briny air throughout the day, reproducing the smell of a coastal city. The first shopkeepers were opening their doors. Some swept sand from their entrances with straw brooms. Others arranged tables outside cafes. Most recognized John. He had been cleaning the district's glass for decades. They waved as he drove past. He raised a hand in return. His favorite cafe stood near the old market square. He parked outside and entered. The owner had already prepared his breakfast. A tiny cup of strong coffee. 2 slices of bread with butter. She placed them on the counter before he had asked. Her name was Amara. She had moved to Kremenos from Lagos nearly 10 years earlier with her husband, an engineer overseeing part of the western expansion. She greeted John in Portuguese, then laughed when he answered with the same phrase he had used every morning for years. His pronunciation had never improved. He sat beside the window. The cafe was nearly empty. A delivery worker carried boxes into the kitchen. A cleaning machine moved slowly across the floor. Outside, a group of children passed through the square, kicking a football between them. Their voices echoed against the buildings. John unfolded the morning newspaper. The front page showed another speculative image of the new district. This version resembled Taipei. Amara leaned over the counter and shook her head. "Wrong again," she said. "You know something. I know everyone knows nothing." John laughed softly. He sipped his coffee and watched the children chase the ball down a narrow lane. For a moment, he remembered playing football in the Rome district when he was young. He had 2 close friends then, Leonardo and Andrea. They would play until the artificial evening lights dimmed and their parents called them home. Leonardo had eventually moved to the surface. Andrea had become a train operator in Kremenos. John had become a window cleaner. It had seemed temporary at first, part-time job while he decided what he wanted to do. Then days became months. Months became years, and the work slowly became his life. He never regretted it. The job had taught him the city. More importantly, it had taught him people. As a boy, John had been quiet. He struggled to speak with strangers. He often stood near groups without knowing how to enter their conversations. But cleaning the dome sent him everywhere. Shopkeepers offered him tea. Children asked questions. Tourists requested directions. Families invited him to meals. Little by little, the city opened him. He learned greetings in dozens of languages. He learned how to listen. He learned that people often became less strange after they told you what they missed. At 8:30, John folded the newspaper and stood. Amara handed him another coffee in a sealed cup. "For your trainee," she said. "You heard about that?" Everyone heard. John shook his head. There were no secrets in Kremenos. He drove toward the beach. The resorts were quiet at that hour. Rows of empty chairs faced the dome. Seagulls moved across the sand, pecking at scraps left from the previous evening. The birds were part of an ongoing ecological program. Kremenos had gradually introduced selected animals into different districts. Pigeons in the European quarters. Squirrels in the parks. Small lizards in warmer zones. A few kangaroos in the Melbourne district. The program was carefully controlled. No one wanted 30 million people living beneath the ocean with an uncontrolled population of animals. John parked beside a maintenance entrance. He removed his shoes and walked onto the sand. The grains were cool beneath his feet. At the edge of the beach, he sat facing the glass. Outside, the reef glowed with color. Red coral spread across the ocean floor. Green plants moved gently in the current. A school of blue fish passed so close that he could see their eyes. They turned together, hundreds of bodies moving as though controlled by a single thought. John rested his arms on his knees. this was one of the few places where he allowed himself to do nothing. No radio, no conversation, no work. Only the slow movement of water beyond the glass. A turtle appeared among the coral. It moved toward the dome, paused, and seemed to study him. John raised one hand. The turtle remained for several seconds before turning away. He wondered whether it could see the city, whether it understood that millions of people lived on the other side, whether Kremenos looked to the creatures of the sea as strange as the surface world looked to him. At 9, John stood and carried his equipment to the wall. Before cleaning, he began the inspection. He held the lamp against the glass at an angle. The light revealed tiny mineral lines and surface marks invisible from a distance. He moved slowly. Every section required patience. A careless inspection could miss something important. He was halfway through the first panel when he sensed someone behind him. John turned. A boy stood several meters away. He looked 16, perhaps younger, tall, broad-shouldered. Dark curly hair, blue shorts, a plain shirt. His hands were buried in his pockets, and he seemed unsure whether he was supposed to approach. John lowered the inspection lamp. "You're here for the cleaning position." The boy nodded. John waited. The boy quickly removed one hand from his pocket and extended it. "My name is Tayo." His voice was quiet. John shook his hand. The boy's grip was stronger than expected. "How old are you?" 16. "School. My parents teach me at home. They work during the day, so I study in the evenings." John studied him. Something about the boy felt familiar. Not his appearance, not his accent, his hesitation, the way he seemed to rehearse each word before saying it. John remembered being that age. Remembered standing on his first day beside an older worker named Samuel, afraid of asking the wrong question. Samuel had retired long ago, but some of his instructions still lived in John's hands. Start at the top. Let gravity help. Never trust a clean surface until the light confirms it. Listen to the glass. John picked up the second coffee and handed it to Tayo. "Your first lesson," he said, "is that no one works properly without coffee." Tayo smiled. It was the first sign that he might relax. They began with inspection. John explained how to angle the lamp, how to distinguish the harmless surface scratches from pressure stress, how to search along the edges of each section where seals met, how to listen for changes in vibration. Tayo watched carefully. He asked few questions, but when he did, they were precise. John noticed that. Many trainees wanted to appear knowledgeable. Tayo wanted to understand. By mid-morning, the beach had begun to fill. Families spread towels over the sand. Young couples walked near the glass. Children pressed their hands against the dome as fish passed outside. Visitors took photographs. Some wore swimming clothes even though there was nowhere to swim. The illusion of a beach was powerful enough that people behaved as though water might eventually arrive. John and Tayo cleaned in silence for several minutes. Then Tayo asked, "Have you ever been afraid down here?" John looked toward the ocean. "Afraid of what?" "The glass breaking." John smiled. Everyone asks that at first. He picked up a small stone from the sand and tossed it lightly at the dome. It struck the glass and fell. Tayo looked surprised. John tapped the wall with his knuckles. More than 3 feet thick, reinforced in layers, monitored day and night. But can it break? Anything can break. The boy's expression tightened. John continued. something is impossible, it means people work every day to prevent it. He raised the inspection lamp. That's why we are here. Tayo considered this. The answer did not remove the possibility of danger, but it gave danger a shape, a responsibility, something that could be watched. Near noon, they stopped for lunch. John spread a towel over the sand and opened the sandwiches he had packed. Tayo sat beside him. For a while, they watched the fish. Then John asked where he had come from. Porto, Tayo said. The real one. Tayo laughed. Yes, the real one. What is it like? The boy looked surprised by the question. Then his face changed. The shyness disappeared. He spoke about steep streets and old buildings, about the river, about bridges stretching across the water, about tiled walls reflecting sunlight, about the smell of bread in the morning, about evenings when the city turned golden. He described standing high above the Douro and watching boats move below. John listened carefully. There was a difference between the way residents of Kremenos described their districts and the way Tayo described Porto. People in Kremenos spoke about design, accuracy, architecture, restaurants, attractions. Tayo spoke about memory. John asked, "Do you miss it?" The boy looked toward the dome. Yes. The answer came quickly. Before John could respond, a woman approached carrying a large woven basket. Tayo stood. My mother. She greeted John warmly. Her name was Sophia. She unpacked bread, grilled sardines, fruit, and a thermos of coffee. The smell of the fish drifted across the sand. She asked how Tayo was performing. John told her the truth. He listens. That is rare. Sophia placed a hand on her son's shoulder. She seemed proud, though worry remained in her expression. She asked John how long he had lived in Kremenos. All my life. Her eyes widened. You've never gone above? Not yet. She glanced at the ocean. Does it not feel strange? What? To know all that water is above you. John laughed. To me, it would feel strange to know there was nothing above me. Sophia smiled, but only slightly. She admitted that she still woke some nights thinking she heard the glass creak. John told her the dome made many sounds. Temperature changes, structural adjustments, current pressure, maintenance systems. Most were harmless. He offered the same reassurance he had given Tayo. They were safer beneath the ocean than many people were on land. No storms, no lightning, no floods, no uncontrolled temperatures. Sophia looked unconvinced. So John asked her about Porto. The effect was immediate. Her face brightened. She described restaurants beside the river. Summer evenings, wine cellars, red roofs, stone streets polished by generations of footsteps. She spoke about the Dom Luis Bridge. She told John that a person had not truly seen Porto until they had stood on the upper crossing and watched the city open beneath them. John listened with the same attention he had given Tayo. When she finished, he told her about Kremenos. He described night walks beside the Han River in Second Seoul, the smell of coffee drifting through the Paris district before sunrise, the quiet of the Stockholm quarter after synthetic snow had fallen, the sight of a humpback whale passing so close to the dome that entire streets stopped moving. Sophia listened. Perhaps John thought every city became beautiful when described by someone who loved it. After lunch, Sophia left. John and Tayo returned to work. The afternoon passed gently. John demonstrated the proper motion of the squeegee. Long strokes, firm pressure, start high. Never let dirty water run over a clean section, Tayo learned quickly. Then, near 3, a shadow moved across the glass. At first, John assumed it was a small submarine passing overhead, but the shadow slowed. A massive shape lowered itself toward the dome. Tayo stepped back. An octopus spread across the wall. It was enormous. Its body was the size of a vehicle. Its tentacles stretched in every direction, each one lined with pale suction cups. The creature pressed itself against the glass. One eye rotated toward the workers. Tayo stared. The octopus stared back. John had seen large marine animals before. Whales. Sharks. Rays wider than city buses. But this was the largest octopus he had ever encountered. For several seconds, no one moved. Then Tayo began to laugh. The tension broke. "It's watching us," he said. "It's probably judging your technique." The boy stepped closer. The octopus shifted one tentacle. Its skin changed color, darkening from reddish-brown to deep gray. Tayo pointed to the glass beneath it. "How do we clean that?" John folded his arms. "We wait for our customer to leave." As though it understood, the octopus released its grip. One tentacle after another pulled away. Clouds of bubbles rose around it. The animal drifted backward, gathered itself, and disappeared into the blue darkness. In its place remained a wide smear of cloudy residue. John looked at Tayo. "We cleaned the outside." The boy stopped smiling. "Outside?" John nodded. "You didn't think all the work happened in here, did you?" Tayo looked through the glass. The ocean suddenly seemed much larger. John remembered the first time Samuel had taken him outside. He had been terrified. Not of drowning, not exactly. He had been afraid of the silence. Inside Kremenos, there was always sound. Engines, voices, footsteps, music, fans, traffic. Outside, there was only breath and water. It was a silence so complete that a person could feel separated from the entire human world. John led Tayo to the truck. They drove north through the district. Traffic thickened as they entered New York. The city planners had reproduced Manhattan's density with remarkable precision. Tall buildings rose close together. Yellow taxis filled the streets. Pedestrians crowded crossings. Advertisements flashed from enormous screens. The district always seemed impatient. Even the imitation Central Park felt surrounded by urgency. They parked several streets from the submarine terminal and carried their equipment through the park. People sat beneath trees. Children played on the grass. Languages overlapped in the air. John heard Spanish, French, Mandarin, Arabic, Russian, Swahili. The park ended at a vast glass building shaped with sweeping curves and a high central dome. This was the Northern Submarine Terminal. Most long-distance travel began here. Passenger submarines departed for Africa, Europe, Asia, Australia, and the Americas. Cargo vessels arrived through lower docks. Inside, the terminal resembled an airport. Restaurants, security gates, waiting areas, departure boards, travelers pulling luggage, families embracing before journeys. John led Tayo away from the passenger section and into an employee corridor. At the equipment room, they were issued suits, masks, pins, tanks, and communication lights. John helped Tayo check every connection. "Never rush this part," he said. Tayo nodded. They entered the airlock. The inner door sealed behind them. The room was small, metal, and windowless. For a moment, nothing happened. Then water began to enter. It spread across the floor, rose to their ankles. disappeared behind the sound of his own breathing. Inhale. A soft mechanical hiss. Exhale. Bubbles rising past his face. The current touched his body. Fish scattered from the entrance. Tayo emerged behind him. For several seconds, the boy remained close to the wall. John gave him a reassuring signal. Then they began to swim. Outside, Kremenos looked less like a city and more like a luminous world sealed beneath glass. The dome curved away in both directions. Buildings rose inside it. Traffic moved along distant roads. People walked beneath them, unaware that John and Tayo were passing overhead. The workers followed the outer wall. Algae moved beneath their gloves. Small fish darted around their equipment. A thin green layer covered one section of the dome. John demonstrated how to remove it without scratching the surface. Tayo copied him. His movements were awkward at first, then steadier. They continued toward Little Lisbon. When they reached the section where the octopus had rested, John handed Tayo the long squeegee. The boy began cleaning. John allowed himself to drift. This was the part of his work he would miss most. Weightlessness, silence, a strange peace of floating between the city and the sea. Inside the dome, 30 million lives continued. Appointments, arguments, meals, deadlines, birthdays, regrets, plans. Outside, none of it could be heard. John sometimes imagined that he was looking at humanity from another world, a visitor, watching people hurry through a place they believed was permanent. A school of luminous fish appeared. Their bodies glowed in brilliant colors. Pink, yellow, green, blue. Hundreds moved around the divers. When the fish turned sideways, their bodies shone. When they faced forward, they nearly vanished. Tayo stopped cleaning. He watched them pass. A small squid drifted near John and settled briefly against the glass. Its tentacles moved in slow, delicate motions. John touched the water beside it. The squid pushed away and disappeared. Below them, the reef spread across the ocean floor. Coral formations rose like miniature forests. Red branches, yellow fans, green mines, purple tubes. Tiny fish moved between them. Seaweed swayed. A turtle glided overhead, its flippers moving with effortless strength. Tayo pointed. The turtle's dark markings gave it a permanently serious expression. It approached them, paused, then rose toward the surface. John followed its movement with his eyes. The water above changed gradually from deep blue to turquoise. Far overhead, the surface shimmered. A dense school of fish crossed beneath the sun. For a moment, the light dimmed. The sea became shadow. Then the school passed, and brightness returned. Two dolphins appeared near the reef. They circled each other. One broke away and approached John. It nudged his leg. John moved aside. The dolphin nudged him again. Stronger this time. It pushed beneath him as though trying to lift him. John laughed into his mask. The sound became a burst of bubbles. The dolphin began swimming upward. John followed. He had not planned to surface that day, but something about the animal's insistence felt like an invitation. They rose. The water brightened. Pressure eased. Then John's head broke through the surface. Air moved across his face. Real air. Open air. He removed the regulator and breathed. For several seconds he said nothing. There was almost nothing to see. Water extended in every direction. The horizon formed a perfect circle around him. cargo ship moved far away, leaving a dark trail of smoke. Seabirds cried overhead. Small waves lifted and lowered him. The sky was pale and vast. No dome, no buildings, no lights, no structure. John looked upward. He had been above the city only a few times in his life. Each visit left him unsettled. The openness felt impossible. Inside Kremenos, the world always had a ceiling. Here, there was no visible end. The sky seemed capable of swallowing him. A gull passed overhead. Its wings caught the sunlight. John closed his eyes briefly. Warmth touched his face. Real sunlight, not filtered through water, not reproduced by lamps. He wondered what it would feel like at evening, how the warmth would fade, how the colors would change, how darkness would arrive without machines. He placed the regulator back in his mouth and descended. Tayo waited near the reef. The boy looked relieved when John returned. Together they swam toward the upper curve of the dome. From above New York, Central Park appeared as a green rectangle surrounded by buildings. Traffic moved in bright lines. Yellow taxis crowded the avenues. Pedestrians looked smaller than insects. The glass silenced everything. John could not hear horns, could not hear engines, could not hear voices. He saw only movement. This was why he came outside whenever city life became too heavy. The glass separated him from noise, worry, and urgency. He could watch the city without being pulled into it. They continued toward Little Lisbon. From above, its pale buildings and red roofs looked peaceful. Families dotted the beach. Couples walked along the boardwalk. The resort pools reflected the artificial sky. Tayo pressed one hand to the dome and pointed toward a cluster of houses. John guessed that one belonged to his family. They swam farther. The architecture changed. The Han River appeared below, dividing Second Seoul from nearby districts. Bridges crossed the artificial water. Rows of residential towers extended into the distance. The Lotte World Tower rose nearly to the dome. Its blue glass narrowed near the top. From outside, it seemed almost capable of touching the ocean. John and Tayo climbed over the highest point of the city. At the center of the dome, they looked down. Kremenos revealed its full design. A circular pond marked the middle. A ring road surrounded it. 8 major avenues extended outward like spokes. Between those roads, the city was divided into sections. Each wedge contained multiple districts. 32 cities arranged into one enormous pattern. From above, London sat beside Beijing, Madrid beside Rome, Berlin beside Montreal, Stockholm beside Chicago. The shapes of each place changed abruptly at the borders. Old stone gave way to mirrored glass. Wide avenues narrowed into alleys. Temples appeared beside towers. A stadium rose beyond a district of courtyards. The London eyes turned slowly near the artificial Thames. The Colosseum stood beneath the water. Red and green roofs marked traditional buildings in Beijing. In Madrid, thousands of people moved toward a football stadium. John had viewed Kremenos from this position many times, but watching Tayo see it for the first time changed the experience. The boy remained completely still. His head turned slowly from district to district. John remembered his own first view from above. He had been 17. Samuel had brought him here. Until that moment, John had thought of the districts as separate places connected by roads. From above, he finally understood the city as one design. Different histories, different languages, different foods, different memories, all sharing the same air, all protected same glass. Tayo turned and gave John a thumbs up. John returned it. They remained there longer than necessary. The work was finished, but neither was ready to go back. John looked at the city and thought about retirement. For years, he had imagined it as rest. Morning walks, long lunches, afternoons on the beach. No alarms, no inspections, no heavy equipment, but now another feeling appeared beneath the relief. Loss. This job had given him access to places few people saw. It had carried him through every district. It had placed him outside the dome, looking in. Soon someone else would stand here. Perhaps Tayo. The thought was not painful. Not exactly. It felt like watching a door close while another opened. They descended toward the airlock. Near the terminal, John paused and looked back. The city glowed beneath the sea. Fish moved above it. A ray passed between John and the light. For a moment, the entire dome disappeared behind its shadow. Then it was visible again. Inside the equipment room, they removed their tanks and suits. Tayo's hair dripped onto the floor. He was smiling openly now. The quiet, uncertain boy from the beach seemed to have disappeared. John handed him a towel. "So," he asked, still worried. Tayo laughed. "A little. That is sensible. But I didn't know it looked like that. Most people don't." They walked back through the terminal. Passengers waited beneath departure screens. A family stood near a gate marked for Cape Town. A young woman cried while hugging an older man. Two children pressed their faces against the terminal glass and watched submarines dock. John wondered how many people passed through Kremenos without ever seeing it from the outside. How many believed they knew the city because they had walked its streets. Perhaps every place had another face, a face visible only from a distance. Outside the terminal, the artificial afternoon had begun to fade. The upper lights shifted toward gold. John and Tayo crossed the park. The air felt warmer after the cold ocean. At the truck, Tayo paused. "I think I want to see every district." John smiled. "There are 32. One each week. That will take a while. I have time." John looked at him. Yes, the boy had time. More than he understood. Time to learn languages. Time to discover cafes. Time to recognize shopkeepers. Time to find quiet streets. Time to become familiar with places that now seemed foreign. John had once possessed that same amount of time. He had spent it without noticing. Tayo held out his hand. "Tomorrow." 5 in the morning. The boy's face fell. John laughed. 6. They shook hands. Tayo hurried toward the transit station. John watched until he disappeared into the crowd. Then he climbed into the truck. Instead of driving home, he headed toward the London district. The city's artificial sunset had begun. Amber light spread across the dome. Building windows reflected gold. Street lamps flickered on. The streets grew crowded with evening pedestrians. John parked near the London Eye. He purchased a ticket and entered one of the glass cabins. The wheel rose slowly. Below, the Thames curved through the district. Red buses crossed bridges. People gathered along the river. As the cabin climbed, more of Kremenos became visible. Paris, Beijing, Rome, Second Seoul. The upper towers of New York. The distant edge of Little Lisbon. At the highest point, the cabin paused. John stood alone beside the glass. The artificial sunset touched the entire city at once. That was the difference. On the surface, he imagined, evening traveled. Light withdrew slowly from streets and rooftops. Shadows lengthened. Colors changed unevenly. One hill darkened before another. One window caught the sun after the rest had faded. But in Kremenos, sunset was engineered. Perfect. Predictable. Beautiful. The light softened according to schedule. Gold became orange. Orange became violet. Violet became blue. John pressed his hand against the cabin window. Beyond the dome, the real ocean was darkening. Night would soon reach the surface. The true sun was descending somewhere beyond the water. He could not see it. Not yet, but soon. In less than 6 months, he would wake on his final work day. He would wear the same overalls, drive the same truck, inspect the glass one last time. Then he would hand the equipment to someone younger. Perhaps Tayo would be ready. Perhaps not. Either way, the city would continue. Morning lights would rise. Traffic would fill the roads. Fish would cross the dome. Shopkeepers would sweep sand from their doors. Children would play football in the squares. And John would leave. He imagined the submarine rising toward London, the long journey beneath the sea, the moment the vessel surfaced, the first breath of cold air, the first sight of clouds. He would walk through the real city. He would cross bridges. He would ride the London Eye. And one evening, if the sky was clear, he would stand quietly as sunlight turned the buildings gold. Perhaps the sunset would be smaller than he imagined. Perhaps there would be traffic noise. Perhaps clouds would hide part of it. Perhaps rain would begin. Perhaps the wind would be too cold. None of that mattered. Perfection was not what he wanted. Kremenos had given him perfection, measured weather, controlled light, exact replicas, safe seasons, predictable days. What he wanted now was something unscheduled. Something no engineer had designed. Something that would happen whether he was prepared or not. The wheel began to descend. The golden light faded. John watched the district sink from view, one after another. When the cabin reached the ground, he stepped onto the platform. Night had arrived. Above the dome, deep-sea creatures were beginning to glow. A line of blue lights drifted slowly over the city. People stopped along the river to watch. John joined them. For several minutes, no one spoke. The creatures moved through the darkness like stars carried by water. John thought of Tayo. He thought of Porto. He thought of the bridge Sophia had described. He thought of Samuel teaching him to inspect glass. He thought of the first crack he had discovered. He thought of the turtle at the beach and the dolphin pushing him toward the open air. He thought of all the places he knew without truly knowing them. Then he began walking home. The streets of the London district glistened beneath the lamps. The river reflected the lights. A soft, artificial breeze moved through the trees. Behind restaurant windows, people ate together. Music drifted through open doors. A child slept against his father's shoulder at a bus stop. 2 elderly women laughed beside the water. A worker washed tables outside a cafe. The city was settling into night. John crossed into the next district. The architecture changed, the language changed, the smell of food changed, but the same quiet life continued. He realized then that he had spent decades believing he remained in Kremenos because there was nowhere more beautiful. That was only partly true. He had remained because leaving required admitting that beauty existed beyond the place he loved. For years, he had treated the surface world as unnecessary, a collection of originals that his city had improved upon. No storms, no broken roads, no dangerous heat, describing Porto had unsettled that certainty. The boy had not spoken about perfection. He had spoken about belonging. Perhaps a place became home, not because it contained everything, but because it held the memories by which a person understood himself. Kremenos held John's entire life, every friendship, every meal, every morning, every disappointment, every ordinary day. To leave it, even briefly, meant stepping outside the only story he had ever known. That was what frightened him. Not the submarine, not the surface, not the open sky. The possibility that he might return changed. At the entrance to his apartment building, John looked up. A whale moved above Chicago. It was enormous, nearly as long as an entire block. Its body passed through the faint glow of the city. People gathered on the pavement. Cars slowed, windows opened. The whale's song could not pass through the dome, but the city became quiet anyway. John watched it move. For a few seconds, the animal's eyes seemed to turn toward the buildings below. Then it continued into darkness. John entered the lobby. The elevator carried him upward. At the 37th floor, he walked to his apartment and opened the door. Everything was as he had left it. The breakfast bowl in the sink, the newspaper on the table, his bed unmade. The room felt smaller than it had that morning. He removed his work clothes and placed them over a chair. Then he stood at the window. The ocean beyond the glass was almost black. Tiny organisms flickered in the distance. The city lights reflected faintly against the dome. Somewhere far above, night covered the surface. Imagine ships moving beneath real stars. Imagine waves rising and falling beneath moonlight. He imagined the continents surrounding him. Madagascar to the west. Africa beyond it. India far to the north. Australia beyond the eastern sea. All those places existed outside the world he could see. John opened a drawer beside the bed. Inside was the ticket to London. He removed it carefully. The print showed the departure date, 2 weeks after retirement. For months he had avoided looking at it. Now he placed it on the table. He would go. The decision felt different this time. Not like a plan, like a promise. The next morning the alarm rang at 5. John woke before the third signal. He dressed, ate, and left the apartment. The city was dark. The ocean glowed faintly above the towers. At the garage, he loaded the truck. When he reached Little Lisbon, Tayo was already waiting. The boy stood near the cafe holding 2 cups of coffee. "You're early," John said. "You said 6. "It is 5:50. Tayo handed him a cup. "My mother says being early is safer than being late." She is correct. They drove toward the beach. The artificial dawn began. Streetlights dimmed one after another. Shopkeepers opened their doors. The white buildings caught the first pale glow. At the dome, John handed Tayo the inspection lamp. The boy switched it on and pressed it to the glass. Slowly, carefully, he began searching for what others might overlook. John stood beside him. For the first time, he did not feel as though he were being replaced. He felt as though something was continuing. The job had passed from Samuel to John. One day, perhaps it would pass from John to Tayo. The dome would still need watching. The city would still need care. The sea would still press against the glass. And every morning, someone would stand at the boundary between 2 worlds and make sure that millions of people remained safe. Tayo moved the light along the seal. He paused. John leaned closer. The boy pointed to a faint line. For 1 sharp second, John felt his heartbeat change. He examined it. The line shimmered beneath the lamp. Tayo remained completely still. John changed the angle. The mark vanished. A school of fish passed across the dome. Sunlight filtered through the water. The city brightened. John watched Tayo return to the inspection, patient, focused, unhurried. He was learning. Behind them, the beach slowly filled. Children ran across the sand. Cafes opened. Seagulls called. The day began. John looked through the glass toward the open ocean. For most of his life, he had believed the dome separated Kremenos from the world. Now he understood that it also connected them. The glass allowed the city to see the sea. The sea to see the city. The old to guide the young. The familiar to create curiosity about the unknown. A boundary did not always mean an ending. Sometimes it was only the place where one world touched another. And perhaps that was why John had finally decided to leave. Not because he loved Kremenos less, but because after a lifetime beneath its perfect light, he was ready to discover what waited beyond the glass. He was ready for weather that could not be scheduled, for streets that did not imitate anywhere else, for bridges worn by real footsteps, for clouds that moved according to wind, for rain that fell without permission, and for one quiet evening beneath an open sky, when the true sun would sink toward the horizon and disappear. He did not know whether the moment would be magnificent. He did not know whether he would laugh, or cry, or simply stand in silence. But he knew he would remember it, because some things become precious, not when they are perfect, but when they happen only once. And somewhere above the ocean, beyond the hidden city, and the millions of lives glowing beneath the sea, another day was already beginning to move toward sunset.